Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I am supremely excited to present to you Dr. Juana Bordas, who is a Latina expert in leadership and has contributed hugely to understanding leadership from the Latino and Latina leadership perspective. She came to the U.S. in a banana boat from Nicaragua when she was 3 years old and exemplifies the many contributions, resiliency, and determination of the immigrant spirit. She has been a women's pioneer, designing and leading women's programs in several national Latina leadership organizations. She is recognized as an elder and an icon in the advancement of multicultural and inclusive leadership that includes the contributions of Latinos and communities of color. She has won many, many awards, too numerous to mention, but they'll all be in the show notes. But I will mention one, which is that she's the recipient of the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association, previously awarded to such thought leaders as Peter Drucker and many others. And she has written several books, and the one that we're most interested in today is The Power of Latino Leadership, which has been revised and updated since 2013 and has some new and exciting things in it that she's going to tell us about. So welcome, Dr. Juana Bordas.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just thrilled to have this conversation and to share some of the things that we've learned about leadership with your people.
And I'm excited to hear all about them. Let's start right away with a little bit about you personally. So, you must live somewhere. Do you have a family? Tell us a bit about your personal life.
Well, you've already said that I'm an elder. So yes, I've had a long and productive life, and I'm very grateful for that. As you said, I'm an immigrant. And when the banana boat landed, when I was 3 years old, it landed in Tampa, Florida. So I grew up in Florida in a real cauldron of different cultures and communities, and had the opportunity to be the first in my family to go to college. But one of the reasons, so I say I'm the first literate person in my ancestral line. And that's real important because as people in communities of color get educated and get credentials, we can contribute at a higher level and also bring our cultural assets to the table. So I was able to go to the University of Florida, which was only 120 miles from my home, but to my immigrant parents, they thought I was going, to another land. And it was a very challenging thing, not only starting school, not speaking English, but also going to college at a time when there were no other minorities, really. My junior year, I marched to integrate the university, and 2 African Americans came. And one of the great things I think about being an elder is that we have that perspective. We know how much things have changed. For example, when I went to college, it was 2 men for every woman, and now it's reversed. There's more women in colleges than men. So I grew up in a large immigrant family, and I have to say that because I'm the youngest daughter is why I was able to get educated, and my brothers, and particularly my 3 older sisters, helped raise me. And that's why I have such a passion, not only for giving back, because I was given so much through my family and through their sacrifice of coming here as immigrants, but also because I feel like I now have the responsibility to share what I know with women and communities of color and other people so that we can build a more multicultural nation. But one of the things I did, and then we can kind of chat about this, is that after I finished college, I joined the Peace Corps. And that was a real important thing for a young Latina back in 64. And by the way, Latinos weren't even on the marquee. They weren't even named a group till 1980. So I had no identity. And we know how identity is so important. So I go to Chile, and that's where I learned about my culture. I relearned Spanish because I had such broken Spanish from not being able to speak it in the schools. And I connected and I saw all the positive things that the Latino or Hispanic culture has, which I had never seen as a child in the United States growing up in the 40s and 50s. So it completely transformed me. So when I came back to the United States, I really understood way back in the early 60s the important role that having an inclusive society and tapping into the potential of all its people could have on this country, and how much Latinos and other people of color had not been included. So my life has really been dedicated to that kind of vision.
Yeah, it's really beautiful and very articulately presented as well. I'd like to back up a little bit and just go into your childhood. I'm wondering if you can recall a couple of incidents that you think were noteworthy, that you remember, that marked you. They might be positive or negative, but a couple of incidents from your childhood. What stands out for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, when I look at my mother, who's really, the person I follow, here's this woman with a fifth grade education. She's in her early 40s. And I think people need to understand that immigrants give up everything. They give up their home, their language, the respect they had in their community, and she comes to this country and goes to the parish priest and says, I can cook, I can clean, I can take care of children. In her humble way, she says this to him. And then she closes the deal. She says, give me a job. I came here so my children could become educated. And when you look at that kind of sacrifice, that kind of vision, that kind of determination, how could I help but not be a strong and powerful woman following in her footsteps?
That is true. That is true. But I really want to hear about your memory, not so much about you as an adult looking back on your mother, but like an experience that you had when you were little. Like when I think about my experience, the very first thing that I can recall is being pulled on a sled through the snow with my mother and looking up at the snowflakes, then falling off of the sled, and my mother coming in, picking me up and putting me back in the sled. So I'm wanting to know what's something that comes to mind when you think about your childhood.
Well, when I think about my childhood, first of all, what I was going to say about my childhood was that when I was growing up, I thought it was fairly difficult. I was poor. I was a Hispanic girl. I was a girl in the 40s and 50s. And I think it's so important that through my work and through my preparation for leadership, which I call in my book, Personalismo, how do you become the person you were meant to be? I was able to look at my childhood in a totally different way. I was able to look at the fact that I walked in a school and couldn't speak English as an incredible strength that I have today, to be able to go into environments that I don't really understand or maybe are not things I grew up with, but that I have that ability to adapt, because I did think my childhood was difficult.
So when you were going through that, though, what did it feel like when you were there and you didn't understand the language? And how did you start to overcome that?
Well, what I write about is that I feel like I had a cultural inferiority complex, Mm-hmm. I write about one incident that was when I was a teenager and I got invited to this party. And so my mother and I went to the Learner store, which at that time, was kind of like a Ross maybe today. And we found this beautiful little dress. It was a polished cotton and it had stripes. It was red with a little bow tie. And so we thought this was great. And for my mother to make that kind of sacrifice, to buy me this dress to go to this party. And then I go to the party and the girls were all dressed in taffetas and tulle. And it was, I was very embarrassed. So I went in the bathroom and hid all night. And as I studied what happens to young people when they're in communities of color like that, and when they are low income and et cetera, it impacts your self-esteem. Mm-hmm. They call it the psychology of oppression, that you begin to internalize the messages that society has about you, that my parents couldn't speak English right, that we lived in the wrong part of town, that they didn't have the right manners. And so I grew up struggling with all that. And like I said, one of the most transformational things for me was going in the Peace Corps and realizing that the culture that I came from was really very rich and had all these great people that had written books and had run countries and had won Nobel Prizes, and they were all coming from my own tradition. So I guess my childhood was, and there's a saying in the African American community, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Mm-hmm. And so part of my message for people of color is, hey, let's look at our childhoods and the things we've overcome as assets. at things that have prepared us to be leaders. And so I just feel like my childhood was kind of that kind of a training ground to be able to really overcome being an immigrant, being a girl, being low income, not understanding the language, coming from that kind of tradition, and then realizing I come from greatness. I come from people.
Yeah. And that often happens when you get out of that environment, right? So you went out of that environment that you grew up in and experienced what it was like to be in Chile and relearn Spanish and discover the nobility of your heritage and all the wonderful things that were there to be proud of. And that must have affected you, right?
Totally. And I love the word nobility. I had never really thought of it that way, Marie. Thank you for sharing that idea. You know, when kids grow up in those kind of circumstances, and a lot of times I say to people, oh, they go like, oh, well, you made it out. I go like, yeah, but what about all the other Juanas? You know, I was very fortunate, the youngest daughter in an immigrant family, 3 older sisters who helped me, a mother with that kind of determination, you know, about her youngest daughter. One story I wanted to tell you is that when I was 13, my mother got me on a bus because we didn't have a car till I was 10. She took me on a bus. She didn't drive across town to this school and took me to meet with the mother superior. Now, you can imagine how scary that was for a 13-year-old. And my mother does the same thing she did with the priest. You know, she gives her story and says, I gave up everything so my daughter could become educated. So the mother superior gave me a half a scholarship to go to this school. And then my mother got me a job. So every Sunday, I would get up at 5 a.m. and walk with her 8 blocks to the Catholic church, and we would watch the children during the masses. We wouldn't get home till like 2:30 in the afternoon. And I earned $15 a month, which I gave to the mother superior so I could go to this school. But here's the capper. 20 years later, I go back and I realized I went to a prep school. I didn't know I went to a prep school because I didn't know what a prep school was. I was just doing what my mother told me to do. And through those kind of experiences, the other girls were going to college. And so here I am in an environment where, you know, all of a sudden I'm being educated in a really good school by these nuns. And I was able to become who I became because of those kinds of opportunities. But how did my mother know how to do that? That's the amazing.
You know, and maybe she didn't, but I think what's really great about your story is that your mother exemplifies that if you don't ask, you don't get. She went and asked for it, and she was determined that she was going to get a yes as an answer and stick it through, right?
She had her eye on me. I mean, you know, she
did.
knew.
This is my youngest child, and this one's going to be the linchpin for everybody else in the family.
No, and here's the story, Marie, that's so important because I do so much work at universities. I just came from Texas A&M. And when I asked, I was a speaker at a Latino youth conference. And when I asked the students how many were first generation college students, at least, I want to say 2/3 of the room, but it was a large portion of the students. And then I tell them, my mother has a great grandson with a PhD in nuclear physics. My mother has a granddaughter who owns her own architectural firm in Texas. My mother has 3 daughters, my daughters, who all have advanced degrees. When you open the door, particularly in an immigrant situation where people are like, they come here. I came here to get an education. I came here for opportunity, and I came here to give back. All 4 of my brothers served in the military. That's what immigrants do. They give back. And so it's such an exciting thing that if we can get our young people into colleges, think of how much they can contribute in their lifetime. Think of how they can help.
Especially women. So when you say,
oh, totally.
So when you say your mother had her eye on you and she saw your potential, and the thing is that when you provide an opportunity to a woman, and particularly a woman who's an immigrant, what happens is they immediately start giving back. And men do too, but women start giving back immediately in ways that are very impactful on their families and on society around them.
Yeah, there was an old saying during the feminist movement, educate a woman, educate a family.
Yeah, educate society, basically.
Yeah,
educate women, you end up educating all of the next society.
Yeah.
So yeah. So this is very exciting. And I think those are wonderful stories that you just explained. When you think about, you know, being born into a Latino family, you know, a Nicaraguan heritage family, and then growing up in the United States, there would have been different cultural things that you learned. Some of them might have been things you didn't want to learn, like thinking you were inferior, but there would have been some things you would have picked up from your family, from the way they behaved, that would have influenced your leadership and your culture now, right? And also from the experiences that not only happened to you, but how you overcame them or how you benefited from them, right? So if you think about those cultures that you were born into and you didn't have any control over, you just happened to be there, or your parents came to the States and you just happened to live there, what would you say stands out as a leadership trait?
I do want to say, Marie, that one of my chapters in my book is called Destino, Finding Your Personal and Professional Purpose. And so in the Latino community, there's a bit of a difference here because, I think in the dominant culture, it has been sort of individualistically oriented. So it's kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and people really think that they're in charge of their life.
But they aren't. They are. That's just an illusion.
Exactly. They're the captain of their ship.
Yeah.
And the way Latinos look at it is that life is a dance, that you're given certain things. I mean, I obviously was given certain gifts, and I was in a position in a family and everything. And I grew up at a time where there were certain opportunities that aren't available today. Like I was able to work my way through college back in the early 60s. Kids can't do that today. So there's certain things that are in your life that you've been given, or your experiences, that kind of shape your life path. And so I have 5 principles. You have to look at where you came from. You have to look at what your assets and gifts are. You have to look at opportunities, because one of the things that happened to me is getting that scholarship. That was an opportunity. Now, yes, I worked for it. And yes, I took advantage of it. But that door opened. Do you see what I mean? And so looking back on your life, you can see the journey that you're on and what your destino is, your destiny or your purpose, because every single person is unique. There's a saying in Spanish, en cada cabeza hay un mundo. In everybody's head, there's a whole world, and that you're perfect, you're totally unique. And so part of your job as a leader is to really explore that personalismo I talk about. Who am I?
It's the dance that you mentioned earlier.
And what's my passion?
Who am I and what's my passion? And how does that affect the people around me, the society around me, and the good that I can do in the world? I really liked your dance metaphor. And I'm thinking your mother took you to the dance floor and said, I'm expecting my daughter to be able to dance. And the school gave you the invitation to the dance. And you said, yes. You said yes, and you danced, right? And then you picked some new partners. Right. So you picked some new partners and you found new ways to dance and new dances, and you were responsive to that, because when you're dancing with someone, you have to respond to your partner and they respond to you. So when I'm thinking about what you just said, part of the Latino way of looking at things is to dance, to be responsive, to pay attention to your partner and your partner pay attention to you. It's not just you going and beating your way through the jungle path and then standing at the top of the mountain and saying, I did it, I'm so great. I think the dance metaphor is very, very important, very powerful.
Yeah. And when you say that thing about I'm so great, it's not something that we do in our culture.
No.
And part of it, by the way, one of my things that I write about is gratitude, is gracias. And one of the ways that Latinos have been able to make it through 500 years of being marginalized and colonized, et cetera, is that we have a deep sense of gratitude. I mean, my mother was convinced that God would help her and that there was divine providence, if you want to call it that. And studies have shown, by the way, that Latinos are the most optimistic people in America. It was a study by the New York Times. 75% of us believe our life's going to get better. And I say, that's true, man. I live in the nicest house I ever lived in. I have, when you look at where I came from, I'm really sitting pretty, And
so isn't gratitude lovely though? I mean,
it's wonderful.
Would you rather talk to someone who has an attitude of gratitude or someone who has an attitude of entitlement,
Right. Right. And also gratitude, I think, is kind of a spiritual salve, I call it, to end this materialism that we're on, because growing up in the 50s and 60s, kids were not at the mall on weekends. That's not what we were doing. And so there's been a whole, with marketing and the mass consumer market, and it makes people unhappy if you're always wanting more, rather than saying, boy, am I grateful for what I have. And more's coming. I mean, there's no reason not to have that attitude, but to appreciate what you have. And so that sense of gratitude. The other thing is it allows you to be a good leader, because if you're grateful, your cup runneth over. You can be generous with people, with your time, with your ideas, because you're not coming from a scarcity mentality. You're coming from, I'm full and I want to contribute and give.
Totally. So then as you grew, you had different opportunities and you entered into different dances. So you joined some other groups. We never get rid of or erase where we come from. We always just build onto it and add more repertoire. So what would you say from your experience working with other I mean, professionally, could have been encountering people from different religions, your travels, maybe working with students, all the different things that you've done. What would you say you have actually adopted from other cultures into your own leadership style?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think many people don't realize this. I absolutely understand. I was the first Latina faculty member at the Center for Creative Leadership, which is a corporate training center. And I basically worked with, at that time, a lot of white male executives. And the point is that I learned mainstream leadership before I could write about leadership in communities of color. Mm-hmm. So the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that people like me understand the mainstream culture. I was educated in the mainstream culture. I understand dominant culture norms. I understand how leadership in that context is.
Because you have to. You have to. You have no choice.
I could not be here without that.
Yeah.
I mean, I have graduate degrees, so I could not do that. And so what I bring to the table is really value added. I bring all my Latino experience. And by the way, it's a different part of your brain, actually, because we live in a left brain culture. And so it's very structured, and information is through reading, whereas our information is oral tradition. And it's also more expansive in a sense. I mean, we don't categorize things at the same way the dominant culture does. One analogy I use is that salsa passed ketchup as America's favorite condiment in the 90s. So it's been 30 years and everybody loves salsa. Well, we love ketchup on our fries, but Salsa Express sells 2,000 kinds of salsa.
Yeah.
I mean, think about all the different kinds of salsas you can have: chopped, liquid, green, red, tomatoes, no tomatoes, jalapenos. And so when you look at communities of color, and particularly the Latino community, we're into kind of inclusiveness and not conformity, having people be respected for who they are, trying different ways of doing things, in particular our immigrant spirit, because 40% of us are immigrants. So we bring that can-do, innovation, risk-taking spirit that immigrants have always had.
Right. So I'm talking about something a little different, though. So, for example, when you went to Chile, Chilean culture is not Nicaraguan culture. It's not American culture. And when you went there, there might have been some things there that struck you as being, I'd like to be doing more of that, or something that, I don't ever want to be doing that, but I guess I'll put up with it now, right? So I've lived in different countries, and whenever I've lived there, something has stuck with me that I wanted to keep. So when I was in Japan, what stuck with me was the reverence that people had when they addressed each other. I hadn't experienced that kind of reverence because in North America, people are not so reverent. They're more in your face. And even if they're quiet about it, there's not that sense of reverence. And I wanted to adopt that into the way that I interacted with other people. How can I be with people so they feel like they're being treated as if they were sacred being? And I've worked to adopt that. And of course, you do it in your own way, because it's not like I didn't grow up there. So I had to think, how could I use this in my own sense of who I am culturally? And I thought, I think I need to be more respectful and more reverent of people at a deeper level. And I can use my experience from Japanese culture, from having been there for almost a year. So I can use that experience to inform me growing that. So I'm wondering if there's something you used from your experience with the culture that wasn't your own that informed you growing it.
Well, I have to say that even though Chileans are not Nicaraguans, there's a cultural core that cuts across all the different Latino subgroups. Mm-hmm. And so when I get to Chile, for example, I was working in poblaciones, which are, barrios or low-income areas. And the one I worked in was 150,000 people. It was on the outskirts of the airport. And that was the time when people were coming from the rural areas to the urban areas. But what I saw was all the values that I didn't know where they came from. For example, the incredible generosity of poor people. Even though they didn't have much, I would be in those poblaciones and they would be feeding me. They would have these little bolillos, which are little breads with avocado on top. No matter how humble they were, they would always share some sort of food. The other thing is the collaboration or the collectivism or the mutuality of the Latino culture. We only got here because we helped each other. My family helped me. We were a little tribe, a little collective, right? And so what I saw when I went to Chile is that is something that is across our culture. We are a we culture, a people-centered culture. People come first to us. And so what Chile really did was help me understand who I was as a Latina. Because, by that time I had been in 16 years of white schools. And so I had lost.
And materialism. And individualism.
Yeah. And I had lost that sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And they call it assimilation. And to succeed in the 50s and the 40s, really, because I started college in 1960, you had to assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
There was no way you could be yourself. And what's so great about today is that, do you know that half the kids under 18 identify as mixed or multicultural?
Yeah.
What's happening today is that my grandson is proud that he's an Afro-Latino. He has that sense of self that comes from, hey, and he's in law school and he's on law review. We can do it. We can do the Anglo culture and we can meet those standards, and we can bring what we have, which is our people, our generosity, our hard work, our openness, our inclusiveness, all the good stuff that comes from communities of color and the Latino culture. That's what I learned. And it was an incredible transformation because there weren't Latinos in the United States in 1966 when I came back that had that sense of self. Because here we were marginalized, we were minorities, and we were, 47% of Latinos are still working class.
Yes.
So here I come back and I'm a cultural powerhouse because I know who I am. The other thing in Chile is I got to see who you wouldn't probably know, but her name was Violeta Parra. She was a great singer. And I got to hear about people who had won the Nobel Prize like Pablo Neruda, and I got to hear him do his poetry. So all of a sudden, I'm not only looking at our culture we've got great intellectual property as well. It just is recognized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then as you know that and you start spreading it around, then more and more people can develop a sense of pride in who they are, which is such a gift, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to mention a little bit about your experience of the generosity of people living in poverty. It just gave me a flashback moment to a time when I was attending an Indigenous organized event, and the people were standing in line for a dinner, and everybody that was there lived on the street. So they were all homeless, and I was standing in line with everybody. And the man in front of me, who looked like he hadn't eaten in days, turned around and said, "You're a guest here, so why don't you go ahead of me?" And I burst into tears. Like, I just thought,
wow.
I mean, he was obviously hungry. And he said, "You're the guest. Let me show you some hospitality. You go ahead of me." I was just so touched by that. And that to me exemplifies what you were just saying.
Well, think of the power in that, though. That he was able to let you go first. That's a very powerful act that he did there.
His second question was, "Do you have any Indigenous blood?" And I said, "I don't think so." And he said, "Well, that's okay. You're still welcome."
Yeah. Well, I have a whole thing in my writing about becoming a Latino by corazón.
By heart, yeah.
Yeah, because, Latinos are not a race. We're actually all the races, A third of us think we're multicultural, a fourth of us are Afro-Latino. Then we have our indigenous background and the European background from the Spanish. And I have French blood. My father was French Nicaraguan. So we're a mixed people, And so we're a culture, and we're united by our values, our history, our experience, our language, so we can invite other people to be part of our culture. I have many people in my family who have married either an Anglo, or my niece just actually married a Spaniard, and my nephew just married a Filipino. So we have a very multicultural family. But the point is, you can become part of our family because we're a culture, and we have this thing called bienvenido, or welcome. Latinos are very welcoming. And so we invite people to join with us. And I think it's a new paradigm for diversity, not about exclusion, or it's about inclusion. Come with us, help us build a new America.
Exactly.
Help us build an America where values are around people and not around things.
Right. So let me go to another question that I have about you, and that is your temperament and your personality. So people are born with some kind of a temperament traits, right, that stay with them. And they may moderate those or add on to them with their personality as they grow and experience life. So people might say, "Oh, yeah, Juana was just like this when she was a baby and she's still like this." And then other things are, "Well, I would never have thought that Juana would have developed that," right? So that would be the personality part. What would you say is temperament that you were born with, and how have you added on?
Well, I think this is an interesting question because, first of all, I'm Caribbean. And when you think of the Caribbean, I'm from the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, you think of Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Colombians, people with a lot of energy. Where does that energy come from? Well, here's what I believe. I believe it comes from our mixture because I am Spanish, I am European, French as well. I'm indigenous. My grandmother was Indian. I have Afro-Latinos in my lineage. So I think when you mix things up, nature loves a hybrid. We have hybrid vigor. And then if you're from the Caribbean, we have a lot of African blood as well in that area. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, my family never left Nicaragua. In fact, we left because there was a tsunami that wiped out the coast. So we were refugees in a sense. But I actually am the first person in my lineage to come into, if you want to call it civilization. You might call it education, civilization, whatever you want to call it. But I'm the real deal. I just came out of the jungle. I mean, I laugh about it, but it's really true. I'm the first one that came out of Cabo Gracias a Dios, was just a small village, and that's where my ancestry is from. And when it was wiped out, that's when we left Nicaragua. But yeah, otherwise I would still be on the coast of Nicaragua eating bananas and shrimp.
That doesn't sound too bad to me.
It doesn't.
The energy and then the adaptability and the people orientation, anything you'd add to that?
You have to know that my mother cooked everything from scratch. So not only do I have a great genetic heritage, and this is all stuff I've had to learn, right? Because when I was growing up eating rice and beans, I thought I was not privileged, right? Only to find out that rice and beans are great for you, and that my mother cooked everything from scratch. So not only do I have good genetics, and I encourage people to really look at their diet. I mean, I have a great diet because of that. And then my parents were working class, so they didn't exercise or anything, but they were very active. And so one of the ways I've kept my energy and kept who I am is that I'm very active. I did 30 minutes on my bike this morning. I did yoga yesterday. And I know that's kind of privileged, but I look at it as a leadership act. Leadership always starts with the leader, with you, with taking care of yourself so that you can give to others, so that you can be available. In other words, energy is not free. You have to work at it. You have to get rest. You have to eat well, and you have to exercise, and you have to surround yourself with positive thinking and positive people.
I really like what you just said, where you said energy is not free. You have to work at it. It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there in abundance, but you can shut it down pretty easily by messing up your diet and not taking care of your body and your spirit and your heart, right?
Yeah, I just sent, for example, one of my nieces has been, now I have to tell you, this is what my mother would say. If you were moping around, she would say, get busy and do something for somebody else. And one of the things I've written on, and I was vice president of the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, I believe it's an empowering form of leadership, not just for the leader, because again, you have enough to give to others. That means that you have efficacy. But it's also empowering others, teaching them how to fish, teaching them how to make decisions, teaching them, how to work together, helping them empower themselves. And so my mother would say, get busy and do something for somebody else. And what she was teaching me through her life was that in service, you find greatness, and in service, you find your own power.
Exactly. And, I think your mother and my mother would have gotten along just great. My mother used to say, look around and make yourself useful.
Exactly. And I think it's a woman's trait, because we've had to deal with so much, being not only the caretakers of our children and our families, but also having now to work and to, we've done the schools, the nonprofits, the churches, you name it. Women wove the fabric of society. So yes, but I do believe that if you can give to others, it does empower you, even the Bible tells you that. It tells you 7 times more is coming back once you give it out. And I think we have to believe that and create a society that takes care of its people, which is my definition of leadership. Leadership is creating a society that takes care of its people.
Yeah, that's the best definition there is. I agree with you. Yeah. So can you recall a time when you became aware that your understanding of the world, and you already mentioned several, but a time when your understanding of the world was in fact limited to your experience, and you would have had maybe a moment of cultural disconnect? Can you think of a time when that was obvious for you?
Well, I think that in my talks now, particularly with Latinos, I talk about the fact that we finally have an intellectual class. And I want to give an example from my book called Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, Leadership for a Multicultural Age, and looked at indigenous leadership in our country. And when you look at John Eckelhawk, who heads up the Native American Rights Fund, he's an elder like we are now, but he and 20 Native Americans went to the University of New Mexico way back 60 years ago. And they were the first American Indians to study American Indian law. And they were able to go back and win sovereign rights for their people because they could finally read the treaties. Mm-hmm. So I want people to really understand that our Latinos, we now have an intellectual class. In fact, 22% of our immigrants that are coming, particularly the economic and political refugees, they have a college degree, 22%. We are the fastest entries into the universities. So I think at a certain point, I understood the importance of, and it's a gift, I think, from the mainstream culture, the importance of becoming an intellectual. I became an intellectual.
You're a public intellectual. So the person who uses the understanding of the intellect to give back to society, wouldn't you say?
Well, I didn't even know that. That's great. I'm a public intellectual. But to become an intellectual, that's a great gift, to go through the universities to understand. I worked with the state of Colorado to do the strategic plan for businesses. I've done a lot of strategic planning with national organizations. To be able to understand that part of the brain was a great gift that I got through my education.
Indeed.
And so now we have an intellectual class, and what you're going to be seeing, since Latinos are going to be 78% of the new entries into the labor force, you're going to be seeing in the next 10, 20 years that Latinos are going to be able to step into leadership at a much higher level because we're integrating both our own cultural assets with that which we've learned in mainstream universities and educational institutions.
Well, bring it on. We're reaching the end of the interview, so I wanted to ask you a couple more questions. And one is, when somebody hires you to do something like a strategic plan or whatever, what brings out the best in you so you can be, really your authentic self? What would help you to contribute in the most authentic way possible?
Well, first of all, I have a deep love of humanity. And so when I go to work with people, I have a connection with them. By the way, the young people call me Tia Juana, which is Aunt Juana, because they want to break down hierarchical structures. They don't like dominance, the millennials and Zs. And so I present myself to them as an aunt, a wise aunt, somebody that you want. Everybody has that in their cultures. Your mother probably had friends that were like aunts to you, right? And so that kind of breaks that down. But what I'm trying to say is that it is my connection with people and my desire not to be like, the leader, but to form a partnership where we energize, learn from, support, and really see the best in each other. And so when I walk out to work with people, I already know their company or their organization or what the purpose of the leadership program is. And so by the time I'm on stage or I'm working with them, I already have a deep connection. And it's back to that personalismo. What kind of a person are you? And how are you going to connect with those people where they live? So I always say, I need to know who the students are, what they've learned, what are their goals? This leadership program that I just spoke in is 35 years of developing Latino talent. So I'm standing on the shoulders, and I respect that. So I think it's my deep respect for people that really makes me effective.
Mm-hmm. So you like to get to know your dance partner before you invite them to the dance.
Yes.
What about something you'd like to promote? I know you've got a book coming up. If you wanted to speak to that, or here's your soapbox moment.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I added the word ahora to my book. So it's The Power of Latino Leadership Ahora, which means now. Mm-hmm. And I think we are on the threshold of an incredible change in society. It's not only the fact that 10,000 baby boomers retire every day and millennials and Zs are the largest generation in history. In 13 years, they're going to be the majority of the electorate. And so I see this incredible shift coming with age, and that Latinos, since 60% are under 18, are going to be at the headways of that change. Then I also, when I look at society, see that half the kids identify as multicultural, and that the multicultural age is coming. Your grandchildren will be mixed. I mean, that's what they
are already.
Yeah. And that's what they love.
Yeah. And I encouraged it.
Bad Bunny is the #1 pop star in the world, and he sings in Spanish. That's how much young kids are connecting to different cultures and music and so forth and so on. So being part of this multicultural age, I want to invite people to be part of it. There's no downside to diversity. Like you said, you add on. You learn from different cultures. They give you an opportunity to be more of who you are. They expand your awareness. And yes, you might need to do some healing if you've lived a privileged life. but we're inviting you to be part of this new world. And we're inviting you to be part of the global community that young people already identify with.
Unity in diversity is a universal law. Take the human body, for example. You don't have 15 hearts.
Right.
The body only functions as a whole if it's diverse, but it's the unity of purpose that comes from all those parts working together, each contributing in their own way, that gives us the ability to move. So once we start to see that, instead of thinking of diversity as a threat, I mean, the threat would be to have 15 hearts. That's definitely a threat. Homogeneity is actually really more like the danger.
Yeah, well, let me give you an example of that. When the settlers and the conquistadors came to this country, we were the great agriculturalists. We gave coffee, chocolate, chili, squash, potatoes, tomatoes. I mean, think about the Incas and how they grew things. So when the potatoes went to Ireland, the reason they had the famine is that they didn't have diversity.
Exactly.
The Incas had 3,000 kinds of potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's in diversity that we find our strength. I always say, if the Great Spirit wanted us to be all alike, he or she would have made us all alike, or they would have made us all alike.
That's why we're created different.
But instead, every single part of you is unique. And so the challenge is to respect your own uniqueness and to understand who you are. That's why I really believe in reflection and, looking at your purpose. By the way, it's organic. It keeps growing as you grow and as you serve and as you learn and as you expand your network and your ability to love and engage people. You just keep growing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think diversity is the next step in human evolution. Our next step as a species.
It's the only step.
Exactly.
If we don't get it, we will destroy ourselves on the planet.
Yeah. And to tap into the beauty of each culture. I'm very grateful to the mainstream culture for teaching me, how to use the left side of my brain, how to structure information, how to become an intellectual, and how to write, because, that wasn't something that was in my tradition. And so every culture has a gift to offer, and you can expand who you are through becoming a Latino by corazón and by loving other cultures.
Awesome. So the book, I will put a link to it in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to say about it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank people that are listening, because obviously you're aware and you want to learn and you want to connect. So I'm very honored to be able to spend this time with you. And I hope our paths cross, and that someday I'll be able to meet some of the folks that were listening.
Awesome. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I would say that spring is here, that spring is a time for rebirth and regrowth, and that it's an opportunity for all of us to let go of what we don't want and to really learn and grow. And that what I'm planning on doing is really looking at how I can get this book out into the mainstream. And I want to ask people, have you read a book on the Latino experience? Do you understand who we are? We're a very complex group. We come from 26 countries. We're a mixture, but yet a third of us were here, or at least a third of the United States was Mexico. So we have old roots here. So I just invite you to become part of my journey and to learn more about the Latino community, and to use this spring to grow, learn, advance, and become part of a greater self.
Thank you, Dr. Juana Bordas. That was beautiful. And it's been an honor. Thank you very much for joining the Culture and Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Marie, for doing this.
Juana Bordas is a woman on a mission, bringing Latino cultural leadership styles to North American organizations, and having Latino women in positions of leadership are a part of that far-reaching mission. Her diligence in pursuing these goals have earned her many accolades and continue to fuel her speaking and consulting career. I particularly enjoyed Juana's energy, passion, and enthusiasm, which infuse everything she says and does. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone you think would resonate with it too. And while you're at it, remember to rate and review on our shiftworkplace.com/podcasts website page. Thank you so much for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MARIEGERVAIS. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.